Hello, hello, everybody. Welcome back to On the Fringe. This is Dave. I'm here with Gavin,
Hey,
and we have a special guest. We are welcoming back Joe Barnes to On the Fringe, and we're going to be talking to Joe today about Kyrgyzstan, a very small country in Central Asia. Joe, you were just saying you're going to Kyrgyzstan next week, right?
Yes, thank you for having me on again. I'd like to consider myself now a friend of the pod.
You are.
Um,
you are. You're a friend of the pod.
Fantastic. Yes, so I'm going to Kyrgyzstan next week. It's parliamentary election week. Kyrgyzstan will be having elections on the 30th of November. And
Hmm.
they will also be getting some rather high-profile visitors. There's a meeting of the CSTO, which is the I say the Russian-led equivalent of NATO, and Vladimir Putin and Alexander Lukashenko, the Belarus president, will be in town just before the election. So yeah, I'll be covering both events.
Interesting. You went to Kyrgyzstan previously as well. You wrote your book. You're one of the only people to have traveled within the former Soviet Union to every country in the former Soviet Union, I should say, after the war in Ukraine started. And just wondering, is this the first time that you've been back since those travels?
No, but firstly, thank you very much for the plug. Yes, I do have a book coming out next year. It'll be called Farewell to Russia: Travels Through the Former USSR, in which, yes, when the war in Ukraine or the full-scale invasion of Ukraine began in February 2022, I took that as my cue to look at what the consequences of the collapse of the Soviet Union have been. Next year will be 35 years since the collapse. Kyrgyzstan, I first went to in 2016. Then for the travels for the book, went there in 2022. And I mean, I live in Almaty, so getting to Bishkek is about 4 hours drive from here. So I'd say once every 2 months or so, I will go down to Bishkek or Kyrgyzstan more generally to report from there.
Yeah, it's a beautiful country too. I studied over there for a couple of months, and if you guys have social media, get on there. You can type in Isuk Cool or you can type in Fairy Tale Canyon, Skazka Canyon, and absolutely spectacular. It's only a couple hours out of Bishkek. So if you guys are in Central Asia or you visit Central Asia, highly recommend going to Kyrgyzstan. It's an absolutely beautiful country. The people are wonderful, and it's some of the best hospitality along with Kazakhstan that you'll find in the region.
Yes, that's definitely true. Upon the collapse of the Soviet Union, if a country could have chosen its own geography, I would say that this would have been some of the worst geographical limitations in terms of actually building a state. It's
Hmm.
essentially very flat land in the north of the country, a huge chain of mountains in the center of the country, and then another piece of flat land in the south of the country, making it very difficult to get between the two. But what it makes it difficult to travel often means that when you do travel through these places, the scenery is rather spectacular. So, as you said, Issyk Kul is this wonderful mountain lake, and there are plenty of other of these mountain lakes in the country. There are lots of sort of horse trekking activities you can do, high altitude yurt stays. This is a speciality of Kyrgyzstan, especially in the summer. And there's a really good network of homestays and sort of trekking trips around the country that you can use. So I know that what we will probably talk about throughout this podcast might be quite a depressing picture that I might paint on a political level. But as a place to visit and in terms of hospitality, it's a really wonderful country.
It is. I'll second everything.
Well, I'm sold, fellas. I'm going to buy my ticket tomorrow. I'm going to Bishkek at some point. At some point in the future. Speaking of the future, and to shift to a more depressing subject, why are these elections significant, these legislative elections in Kyrgyzstan?
Well, I guess this is the depressing part. They're not. Um, Kyrgyzstan has historically been the most democratic and politically open country of the
Hmm.
five Central Asian stands. the others being Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and Turkmenistan. All since the sort of mid 1990s, the other four have been reasonably repressive autocratic dictatorships, whereas Kyrgyzstan has had a degree of political openness, its fair share of revolutions. It's had three revolutions in 2005, 2010, and one most recently in 2020. But it's also had like a enormously vibrant civil society where
Hmm.
people felt that their voices needed to be listened to and expected their politicians to listen to them. It's had a very creative and definitely very brave journalistic media sphere. And yes, a parliamentary election usually in Kyrgyzstan would be something that would be a lot of fanfare around it, a long campaigning season. Obviously, not being the most developed of democracies and quite a young country, they haven't necessarily had the time to develop institutions to protect against things like vote buying and sort of the
Hmm.
corruption that can often happen in less well developed democracies. And this often would lead to revolutions. But this election has been, at least the build up to it has been, it's been very tame. A lot of candidates are not affiliated to any political party. They're sort of standing for themselves. So this massively dilutes the importance of each candidate if they're not allowed to unite with other people. Just yesterday, the head of the Socialist Party of Kyrgyzstan was arrested
Hmm.
on the charges were planning to incite mass unrest. So yeah, it's quite a grim picture we've got at the moment.
So, to what do you attribute this turnaround? Because I think you said the last revolution was in 2020.
Hmm.
So, how do you get from a presumably somewhat democratic revolt 5 years ago to a situation where we're sitting down and you're going, well, they're going to have elections, they probably won't matter?
Great question. So this is probably time to introduce the current president of the country, Sadir Japarov, and his right-hand man, Kamchibek Tashiev, who is the head of the security services. Together, they are known as Eki Dos, which is Kyrgyz for two friends. Um, so these two, or Japarov in particular, had been in prison when the 2020 revolution occurred. He had been in prison because, how would I put this politely? He was accused of kidnapping and extortion because he had a long running campaign to get the only gold mine in the country, the Kumtor gold mine. He wanted to get this nationalized, and
Hmm.
this was his big talking point. In 2017, he was put in prison, sat behind bars all this time. And then this revolution happened, and one of the first things that his supporters did was spring him from jail during the chaos of these protests. In reasonably murky circumstances, he quite quickly went from jail to the position of prime minister. Not that this is an unheralded thing. You could say Nelson Mandela famously quickly went from jail to high office, so it's not an unusual thing to happen. But having attained power, I think he sort of set about trying to co-opt a lot of the people that they've been revolting against. He was a big ally of Kyrgyzstan's second president, Bakiev, who was in power from 2005 to 2010 until another revolution got rid of him. So throughout this period, Japarov has helped the old regime of Bakiev
Hmm.
slowly worm its way back into power. I think this
Is it?
often happens with, sorry, I think this often happens with so-called reformers coming back. I mean, this was I seem to remember when Donald Trump came into power in 2017, he came as the outsider, promising to drain the swamp. The swamp seemed to remain. And it tends to, I don't know, I think in lots of countries, the people in the shadows tend to remain there. Continuing the story, when Japarov came into power, he was quite open about the fact that he thought Kyrgyzstan needed to change. It wasn't a very rich country. Like GDP was some of the lowest in the former, per capita was some of the lowest in the former Soviet Union. And he blamed, okay, we have an open democratic system, but this system isn't effective because these politicians are spending so long arguing amongst themselves. So he made the classic strongman case. We need a strongman to root out
Mm.
these problems and put the country back on the right track. And so he decided to change the constitution. He was originally elected as acting prime minister, but he made these constitutional changes that greatly enhanced the power of the presidency, weakened the parliament, that has turned it into something of a rubber stamp chamber, which is again why one of the reasons why these elections are not so well heralded. He's actually on an economic level been reasonably successful. Some of
Mm.
his timing has been fortunate in that Kyrgyzstan has profited massively from Russia's war in Ukraine or the sanctions that have been leveled upon Russia. Kyrgyzstan has acted as somewhat of a middleman between European countries selling to Russia, China selling things to Russia. One example, I think it was in 2023, China sold about 77,000 cars to Kyrgyzstan, which was not previously a big importer of Chinese cars. But Kyrgyzstan sold about 66,000 cars to Russia, and Kyrgyzstan doesn't have many car factories. So it seemed quite obvious that this is a sort of a middleman. So it's been creaming off a bit of the profit from that, and this has really helped the country. So he's seen a bit of a budget windfall. I think
Mm.
GDP, if you look at just the figures in US dollars, have doubled since 2020. So with this money, he's been able to build a far stronger security apparatus than anything that Kyrgyzstan had before. And he's used this to make life difficult for anyone who criticizes him. He's especially gone hard on people who accuse the regime of corruption, who say that certain policies are wrong or he's running the country the wrong way. Then he comes down very hard on these people in a sort of preemptive way, in
Mm.
order to try and ensure that this scares people into silence.
I did a little bit of research beforehand, and it looked like that he had a really strong social media campaign to help him get elected, right?
Mm.
And just curious, now over in Kyrgyzstan, is there much presence on social media about the elections and about the candidates? Or is that something that's kind of, gone away?
Each candidate has a big social media game. I think it has to be the part of any candidate's election campaign. One of the big issues candidates have in terms of if they're saying anything against the government is that there have been three media organizations which have just been branded extremist organizations within the past month, and disseminating or even liking any of their social media posts can land you yourself in jail. So this means that the airwaves are dominated by pro-government messaging. But yeah, it's definitely true that they have in 2020 they had a very strong social media campaign. He's quite a populist president. He's very strong on speaking Kyrgyz language. There's always historically been a language issue in the country where elite in Bishkek would speak Russian, whereas most of the more rural population would speak Kyrgyz. So he was primarily trying to appeal to them by addressing them in Kyrgyz, bringing back the ak kalpak, which is the traditional Kyrgyz hat. So instead of dressing in a Western suit, um, well, he would still dress in a Western suit, but instead of adopting these Western traditions, he would also very obviously be identifying himself as Kyrgyz, as one of the people with the kalpak, the hat he wears. So yeah, he was a strong social media campaigner. I think that's definitely fair to say.
With regards to the CSTO, how does this sort of tie into where the country of Kyrgyzstan is at, where the region is at, where the organization itself is at right now? Or is it just a nice place to have a meeting?
Central Asian leaders in general often get accused of going to meetings for the photo shoot, essentially. And it wouldn't
Hmm.
surprise me if this is something similar. The CSTO has a rotating presidency. Kyrgyzstan holds it this year. But yeah, it's quite rare that Vladimir Putin, especially, will visit the country. He hasn't made many foreign visits since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine began. The CSTO, the countries within it are Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan from Central Asia, Russia and Belarus, so I guess from Europe, and then Armenia. So probably what would you describe as Russia's closest allies in the former Soviet space over the past 30 years. Yeah, the CSTO has had some notable military involvement. The most famous one over the past few years was the CSTO being called to Kazakhstan
Hmm.
in January 2020, when Kazakhstan was rent by protests, which took over Almaty, and there were sort of running battles in the streets. The president of Kazakhstan, Tokayev, took the decision to permit the shoot on sight of certain protesters to try and get these shut down. And he called in CSTO troops, and obviously the majority of these were Russian, to secure the country's airports, ports, railway stations, things like that. So that was a big role that the CSTO played. It's been less active than it possibly could have been in the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict. So obviously Armenia had the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict with Azerbaijan, and there was always the potential that Armenia could have called on CSTO for help in that conflict. But the problem with the CSTO is that many of its members, being so Muslim countries, were slightly more favorable towards Azerbaijan than Armenia. So Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Kazakhstan are definitely more friendly towards Azerbaijan.
Hmm.
This limited what involvement the CSTO was ever likely to have. So Armenia did trigger the equivalent of NATO's Article 5 in order to try and get support in 2022 and 2023. And the CSTO did very little. You could say, yeah, it's a bit of a talking shop. It's
Hmm.
also worth noting that so the CSTO, I haven't explained, is the Collective Security and Treaty Organization. And security, it doesn't necessarily just mean from external threats. A
Hmm.
lot of the countries within the CSTO are authoritarian regimes, and the biggest security problem they perceive are threats from within and to the stability of their regime. It could be that while the journalists are waiting outside those closed doors at the meeting in Bishkek, they'll be swapping tips on how best to oppress their people. Who knows?
Just want to return to a name you mentioned earlier. You talked about Sadir Japarov quite a bit. What about Kamchibek Tashev, who I know pretty much nothing about, and you described as the head of state security in Kyrgyzstan? How has he sort of shifted to his position and become such a powerful person in the regime?
Okay, so for believers in nominative determinism, um, Kamchibek Tashiev is your man. Kamchibek means the Lord of the Whip, and Tashiev
Oh,
means son of stone. So
wow.
the
What a
uh,
name.
the writing was on the wall, you might say, from a young age. He met Japarov, I think it was around 2022. No, sorry, 2012, 2013. They were both part of the same political party, the Atatürk political party, which is a
Ah.
reasonably nationalist party, and they bonded over this Kumtor gold mine, this gold mine in the center of the country, which was responsible for about 25% of the country's GDP.
Hmm.
And it was owned by a Canadian company, it was Cantera. And they wanted this mine nationalized, and they had been working together um, to try and ensure that it was. Yeah, they were very close through the period where Japarov was imprisoned. And when Japarov came to power, one of the first things he did was to make sure that Tashiev was alongside him. I think if you ask plenty of people in Kyrgyzstan, there's even the perception that Tashiev is the real power in the country. That Japarov does the state visits, does the pomp and ceremony, but the guy who's making the real decisions is Tashiev. His past is quite a how would I say quite a nationalist past. He's made
Hmm.
a lot of comments about the sort of purity of the Kyrgyz people. Kyrgyzstan, especially upon independence, was not just Kyrgyz people living there. You had large Uzbek population in the south. In Bishkek, especially, you had a lot of Russians and Ukrainians and ethnic Germans. But yeah, he has long been about sort of purity of Kyrgyzstan, to use his words. And this was way back in 2010 when there was a
Hmm.
pogrom against Uzbeks in the southern city of Osh in the wake of the 2010 revolution. So yeah, I'd probably define him as a guy who's reasonably shadowy, but quite prepared to use force and be seen to use force. I think he came out publicly last year and said he ordered a hit on one of Kyrgyzstan's biggest mafiosos, criminal kingpins, and he was shot very publicly in a place called Blonder Pub, which I used to go to back in the day. It was actually quite a good bar, but it's been shuttered up ever since. But yeah,
Wow.
Tashir was quite happy to own the hit. So yeah, he's clearly not a guy who cares about his strongman reputation.
And you
Well,
kind of brought
yeah.
this up a little bit.
No.
You have had ethnic tensions in Kyrgyzstan for decades. You could even go back centuries. And correct me if I'm wrong, but in the last year and a half, they were able to actually end a lot of the fighting with Tajikistan in Batken, correct?
Yes, pleased you asked that because it's like I say, it's not entirely bad news what's happening in Kyrgyzstan, and one of the signature achievements in the region over the past 30 years has been finally resolving these border disputes, which have been going on in the Fergana Valley between Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and Kyrgyzstan. To cut a long story short, when the Soviet Union's borders were drawn, they made quite a strong attempt to make sure that each ethnic group was within the borders of its own country, within the Soviet Union. And this resulted, when the Soviet Union collapsed, in incredibly complex snake-like borders with exclaves and enclaves dotted around them, and this especially in the Fergana Valley, where you had Kyrgyz and Uzbeks and Tajiks all living side by side, and it took about 30 years to unscramble the omelette. It was something that nationalist politicians in especially in Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan reasonably happy to exploit because it was an issue that, as often with conflicts, distracts from other problems. But yeah, since the coming to power of Shavkat Mirziyoyev in Uzbekistan in late 2016, there's been a big push, especially from Uzbekistan, for regional integration and for trying to put some of these problems behind them. And yet, early this year, it's February, March, the last of these borders, which is between Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, they managed to come to some sort of agreement on how to manage that border. Each side made some concessions, which they hadn't been willing to make for a long time, partly for financial reasons, because they didn't want to bear the cost of relocating people, because these were two very poor countries, and the state didn't have the budget necessary to help relocate people. So yeah, in some cases, Kyrgyz people who were living in what was going to be given to Tajikistan were relocated into new houses which had been built for them in the south of the country. I covered it early this year. Haven't been back to Batken since, but from what I understand, the piece is holding. They had a conference in October on regional cooperation in that area specifically, and all the vibes coming out of there are very positive. It might be the case, however, that these are just vibes coming from the capital city, and people in the region are more disgruntled than we know.
I was just sort of wondering, do you think that part of the reason that they were able to get to a solution, and I know this is a very sort of cynical mode of thinking, but is this sort of thing easier when you do have more authoritarian leaning states?
I was just going to ask that same question.
Uh, I Short answer, I think yes. Um, I think part of the problem that has happened in that region is when you do have ethnic imbalances and ethnic tension and a very open media and a media that can easily be influenced from outside powers and stoked up quite easily, then I think those tensions could bubble up quite a lot. The other thing is that when you don't have a strong sort of authoritarian core, power, especially in a more mountainous country, tends to be localized.
Hmm.
And just because something is positive in Bishkek, which is a whole mountain range away from the southern part of Kyrgyzstan, some local problems might, they feel, might need local solutions. The biggest ethnic problems that Kyrgyzstan had were actually in the wake of the 2010 revolution, just when the government's authority was weak. They had a provisional government in place to try and manage the process before the next elections. And that's when there were these massive ethnic pogroms in Osh, where the Uzbek population was targeted. It's something I've thought about as I've traveled around the former Soviet Union, not wanting to be a cheerleader for authoritarianism, but it does keep a lid on because it keeps a lid on all forms of freedom of
Yeah.
speech. That includes the bad stuff, I guess, would be the nicest way to put it.
And also, I mean, just based on what you were saying about the people currently in government in Bishkek, they can hardly be attacked as not being nationalistic enough. So that's also just, it kind of shuts down that conversation in a way where even if you could go, well, this isn't good for the Kyrgyz people, that it's coming from guys who are openly very nationalistic makes it kind of difficult to criticize, or would make it difficult to criticize, I guess. But as you pointed out, that space isn't even there anymore. What do we want to look at as we wrap up here?
Well, on the same line, we're talking kind of ethnic tensions. So in the last couple of years, there's been a lot more trade between Kyrgyzstan and China. And a lot of it, I think, is geography, like you were saying earlier. Kyrgyzstan is kind of being used to get around sanctions to Russia. And you have a lot of ethnic tensions as well, from what I understand, with Chinese coming into Kyrgyzstan. And this was a week and a half ago. I saw a video where there were some Chinese miners and Kyrgyz who were fighting. And I think the police came in and broke it up and arrested some people. Overall, do you think the situation in Kyrgyzstan is still, I would say, right on a knife's edge in terms of ethnic tensions, where there's still a lot of, I guess, trust within people in Kyrgyzstan to stand behind their ethnicity rather than the identity of, someone who's in Kyrgyzstan? I mean, a Kyrgyzstan citizen. I'm Russian or I'm, Kyrgyz or I'm Uzbek. and they really don't have a strong national identity.
With China, I mean, there is a long history of sinophobia.
Hmm.
One of the great figures of Kyrgyz myth is a guy called Manas, and Manas is a sort of the King Arthur sort of figure, or Robin Hood,
Hmm.
this sort of folkloric hero, and uh, pretty much every Kyrgyz city will have a Manas street. Bishkek has a Manas airport. The third largest city in the country, which used to be called Jalalabad, has been renamed Manas. I think it was in October. Manas was famous as a warrior who fought the Chinese. Well, he fought a lot of people, fought a lot of Kyrgyzstan's enemies, but foremost amongst these was the Chinese. So this rivalry with China goes back a long time. There was especially high levels of fear, I would say, about China during the what would be the late 2010s, given what was happening in Xinjiang with the Uyghur population, but also other Muslim groups, including Kyrgyz and Kazakhs, who were living in Xinjiang at the time. And there was worry that a country that could do that to its own citizens, what would they do to countries who are on their border? Especially given the obvious military growth of China, the obvious economic growth. There's that fear, like when you're a
Mhm.
small nation of 7 million people, as Kyrgyzstan is, and you've got 1.4 billion people on your doorstep. Yeah, that's focuses the mind. What's that? 200 times as many people. Focuses the mind a bit. On the other hand, I would say this goes possibly hand in hand with the informational clampdown.
Mhm.
But there is more positive noises being made about China. Like China has invested a huge amount in Kyrgyzstan over the last decade or so. They're going to be building this new railway from China through Kyrgyzstan to Uzbekistan, which means Kyrgyzstan will have a direct rail link to China. That should help develop the south of the country in particular. So, as a country which doesn't have a huge amount of natural resources, huge numbers of people work abroad, primarily in Russia. Anyone who's willing to pump money into the country is welcome, and China is pumping in far more than most. So it's definitely a two-way conversation when it comes to China. And I'd say the general vibes recently have been very positive.
Well, on that positive note, thank you so much for coming on the pod today, Joe. I feel like I learned a lot about Kyrgyzstan. Um, it's been great having you. Before we go, just want to plug the book one last time.
Uh, Once again, thank you very much for having me. Yes, the book is called Farewell to Russia: Travels Through the Former USSR, and it will be out on March the 5th next year. I'm sure it'll be available in all good bookstores.
Fantastic. All right, Dave, you
Excellent.
want to sign us off?
Yeah. Thank you guys very much for listening. Thanks again, Joe, for coming on. And once again, thank you to all of our supporters, our subscribers. If this is the first time listening, thank you very much for checking us out. Please don't forget to give us a like, a comment, or send us a message. And if you'd like to be on the podcast as well, shoot us a message and we'll be in touch. Take care. And Gavin, I'm going to hit the button.
Hit the button, Dave.